Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two guests. I'm going to do a very short introduction to them, and it's based on an article that they are joint authors of that appeared in Foreign Affairs entitled Putin's New Hermit Kingdom, How It's Becoming a Closed Dictatorship. ANDREI YAKOVLEV is an associate at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and a visiting research fellow at Script Project at Freie Universität, Berlin. Vladimir Dubrovsky was a senior economist at Case Ukraine. He is an expert on applied institutional and political economics, corruption, economic reforms, etc. Gentlemen, I'm absolutely delighted that you could join me today.
Yeah, we are also glad to be here.
Let's start with the big topic here. And there was endless debate about whether Russia was a totalitarian society prior to the full-scale war, whether it was some kind of hybrid autocracy. Remember the book Spin Dictators, written by Serhiy Guriev. But it seems to have gone down a significant sort of authoritarian slide in the context of full-scale war, or do you see the roots of this authoritarianism starting far, far earlier?
In my view, first of all, this war, of course, it is the result of changes initiated by Putin in the Russian political system already in mid-2000s, with removal of step by step of all constraints, for him. Formally, it was, in my view, really his personal decision to start this war. But we can remember this meeting of Security Council, just one day before the war, and it was quite impressive in terms of all these faces, of these people, and it is about really top people in Russian elite, But the problem is that Kremlin itself was not ready to real war. I suppose Vladimir will add some points on his side, but this war really created a very serious challenge for Kremlin and really limited opportunities. It is some kind of corridor without big options for the exit, in my view, for Putin and for Kremlin now.
I think he started the way to this circle of authoritarianism and the war long before. Actually, indeed, from the very beginning. Although from the very beginning he may not anticipated this war, but he tried to play on two desks simultaneously. On the one hand, trading with the West, enriching his nearest circle and himself, enriching the Russian people, and on the other hand, raising up from the knees, making Russia great again, and so on. But at certain point, these two motives came to a contradiction, because you cannot trade with the West and confront with the West simultaneously. And this was also a point when he was almost forced to change his main ground of legitimacy, because in the years of 2000s, his legitimacy was due to economic motives. People has been going richer and richer, and they sincerely supported Putin, because after very hard 1990s, he brought some prosperity. But this ended with the crisis of 2008, and eventually he had to offer something. First, he tried, or Medvedev tried, to offer a certain concept of developing state, of the future modernization, but it failed because it was not grounded on the right ground, and it was not comparable it was not compatible, sorry, with the corruption, which was very much endemic in Russia those times. And eventually, after the protests of 2012, Putin finally focused on the Siloviki and respectively on the confrontation with the West as the main legitimizing factor. And in this way, he successfully annexed Crimea, and this highly enhanced his popularity. And he tried to repeat the same operation in the larger scale at the beginning of 2022 with the whole of Ukraine. And in such a way, he would, first of all, signal to his population that he is strong, he is mighty, he is expanding the territory, and so on. Secondly, he would signal to the West that he is strong, he is mighty, he could somehow push NATO out of Eastern Europe and don't mess up with him. And if he would be able to realize this idea, it would be sort of perfect victory for him. But he, of course, underestimated Ukrainians. He sincerely thought that Ukrainians are the same people as Russians, which is actually wrong. And he thought that most of Ukrainians would support his invasion as some liberation from the Nazi rule, which was absolutely crazy. But he believed in this theory. And eventually he has got involved in the full-fledged war, which he did not intend to. But now we are for the fourth year in this war, and he is somehow accommodated to it and used it to further strengthen his control over his grip over the society. And so far, he was more or less successful in it.
What leads off that, I think, is this interesting idea that the full-scale war is incompatible with economic relations with the West. But Western powers have found it very difficult to wean themselves off Russian hydrocarbons. In fact, there are still loopholes there. Russian LNG ships, to my knowledge, are still being serviced in some Western ports. And of course, we're still funding partly Russia's war effort. Putin may have actually believed that this incompatibility was only temporary because the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Bolotnaya, and then the subsequent repression of his own people, the invasion of Donbass and Crimea, none of these exacted a really high or prohibitive cost to him. He may have assumed that if the war was swift and if it was as as victorious as it was perceived to be in Crimea, with relatively little loss of life and certainly little cost, he may have believed this full-scale war may not actually have been incompatible with continuing economic relations with the West. That's one point of view. Speaking to some Russian sort of dissidents, if we want to call them that, they voice what people like Lavrov, Peskov, and others have said is that they may have had a belief that full-scale sanctions on Russia were inevitable, no matter what they did. And this is an extremely paranoid kind of view of the world. But they may also have believed, look, we're going to be punished whether we invade and whether we don't, so we might as well invade. Which of those, do either of the ideas have any kind of validity, do you think, Andrei?
First of all, as I told already, and Vladimir was agree, Kremlin was not ready to real war. It was really some kind of expectations of 2014 with very short campaign, with some kind of sanctions afterward. But Kremlin really didn't believe in large-scale sanctions, of current scale. But reality was very different, not only in terms of resistance on the Ukrainian side, but also in terms of really large-scale sanctions on Western side. Of course, there is a lot of questions about some kind of contradictions, in design of sanctions, because the most sensitive sanctions for Russian oil export were introduced only in December of 2022. And as a result, Kremlin and Russian budget got a huge amount of money, additional money in 2022. Russian export earnings in 2022 were $100 billion more comparing to 2021. And in my view, it is exactly the result of these contradictions in sanctions design. But the problem is that starting with war, Putin really closed other options, because he really tried to find some kind of balance for really 2 decades between interests of different groups in Russia, and also between interests of different groups in Europe. For instance, this policy, mostly initiated by Germany, but supported by many other countries, with idea that economic cooperation with Russia will provide the base for security in Europe. Kremlin used this policy very efficiently. It's true. But now we can see that such kind of approach really failed. And even with some business interest on the European side, which are thinking about some kind of potential cooperation with Russia and so on and so on, from political point of view, it became clear that it's simply impossible for Russia, for Europe, in terms of security. And therefore, opportunities for Kremlin and for Putin are really constrained. And for instance, even in terms of this new policy of US administration, with all these attempts of Mr. Trump to propose something, to offer something for Putin, in real terms, it's not possible without participation of Europe, because the most sensitive sanctions are provided now by Europe in real terms. And exactly Europe was the main trade partner for Russia, not US. So, but at the same time, the problem for Kremlin and for Putin now is that in 2023, 2024, due to availability of this excessive export incomes on one hand, and also due to availability of all these reserves accumulated during 20 years before, Kremlin could provide necessary financial resources for army defense industry and so on. But at the same time, it could cover all social obligations, and it could provide also some rents for elites, compensating quite significant losses of many elite groups due to international sanctions. But this time is over. Already from the autumn of last year, it became clear that Kremlin simply doesn't have enough money to do all these things. And at the same time, with a current budget approved by State Duma in November and in December for next 3 years, 2025, 26, 27, it became clear that army and defense expenses is key priority for Kremlin as before. So, and for instance, all this increasing pressure on elites, which became visible already from 2024, but became more and more visible just now. In my view, it is the indicator of real internal tensions in Russia. And maybe a quite important point, especially for external observers, is about non-stability of regime. Because, especially it is from my conversations with some colleagues in US, especially starting from 2024, mostly, after this not very successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, they started to think about some kind of midterm scenarios of interactions with Russia and so on, considering Russia as some kind of new version of late Soviet Union of Brezhnev time. With idea that regime is stable, it can be stable for maybe years or even decades, but it will collapse finally, like Brezhnev's Soviet Union. In my view, it is quite a big mistake, because regime is not stable. Regime now is in transition from really some kind of authoritarian hybrid, yeah, to a much more radical version. It's possible to discuss what kind of scenarios will be used in reality, yeah, closer to North Korea or closer to Iran and so on and so on. It could be different versions, but it will be much more repressive regime, much more closet. So for instance, in last week in Russia, I think in many regions it was news about serious problems with access to Telegram. And I think Russian government and Kremlin are really thinking about closing access to internet. So, but at the same time, we can see stronger pressure on different groups in elites, first of all, in business elite. So, and in reality, it will be not about Soviet Union of Brezhnev time, but unfortunately, it can be something similar to North Korea, but of Russian size and with Russian military potential. And in my view, it will be dangerous not only for Russia. We are talking not about Russia now, yeah, but it will be really very dangerous for security in Europe and maybe not only in Europe. And therefore, it's necessary to be prepared for such kind of scenarios. And unfortunately, in my view, many people on Western side, I'm talking not only about US, but also in Europe, first of all, because it is a question for Europe, are not ready to such kind of question, to such kind of scenario.
Well, we'll dig in a minute what kind of characteristics such a hermit kingdom could adopt and how we see some of those emerging already. But I'd love to hear from Vladimir and his view on this as well.
Yes, thank you. Andrei raised a very important point. I will start with a very simple, maybe primitive description of Putin's interest and his sort of median voters' interest. On the one hand, this is a material interest, so Putin would like to get richer, and his voters, of course, would like to get richer. On the other hand, this is this imperial mindset that he is endowed with, and the idea is to make Russia great again, to make other countries fearing Russia again, like it was with the Soviet Union, and so on. And these ideas are, as I said, contradicting. But Putin, in addition, has even more important interest. It's interest of staying in power, because only by staying in power he is able to realize each of these ideas or both of them. And so if he likes to stay in power, he needs legitimacy in the eyes of his people, and more important, legitimacy in the eyes of his entourage, in the eyes of his closest circle, because Russia is predominantly, as what Madjer and Madlevich call it, mafia state, a state organized like a mafia, not necessarily being mafia in its activities and so on. And I don't mean that they are trading drugs and so on, although they may be, but organized like a mafia, and the authority of a mafia leader is based on his invincibility, in his persistence, in his toughness, and so on. Putin should signalize it every time, and actually this war invasion of Ukraine was one of such signals to his people and to the world. And so once he stepped on the way of confrontation, it is a slippery slope, because the more he confronts with the West, the less are opportunities for making people richer and legitimize himself in such a way. The more he needs siloviki to suppress people's some, it may be muted, dissatisfaction. And those Siloviki are endowed with this imperial mindset from the Soviet time. So the more he goes this way, the less he has opportunities to come back. And this is the driving force behind this building of a hermit kingdom and so on and so forth. In terms of coming back to your question about role of the sanctions and the West, of course, he anticipated that if he annexes Ukraine like he did with Crimea, the consequences would be roughly the same, maybe some more severe, but he was well prepared. He accumulated the reserves for many years. He also conducted a very tough policy of austerity economic policy in Russia. Russia always had a deficit in the budget, unlike many Western countries and maybe the most countries in the world. And he had, therefore, a lot of actual and formal reserves to weather this period of sanctions that would follow the annexation of Ukraine. But of course, when it came to the full-fledged war, the West, we Ukrainians appreciated very much, have eventually, although with delays that Andrei mentioned, but still imposed some quite severe sanctions, and some of them, like refusal to buy Russian gas, were very painful for respective countries like Germany. But still, it is not enough to create a real threat to this regime. So Putin is not going to stop the war unless he will feel a threat to his regime comparable in scale to the threat he would face if he stops the war. So if the sanctions, along with support of Ukraine, would create such a threat, then he probably would have to either stop the war or maybe even somehow retreat from Ukraine, or maybe he will be expelled by other members of his entourage. But in this or that way, with Putin or without him, Russia will have to stop the war and retreat. Otherwise, as long as, unfortunately, some European countries buy Russian LNG, buy Russian oil, I mean the tube oil, and also there are some circumventions of sanctions of embargo on the seaborne oil, then it would be hard. But the main problem, of course, is not in Europe, but in China and India. They buy the bulk of Russian oil, and they keep the regime afloat. And as Van E has recently openly admitted, China is not going to allow Putin to fail. That's the problem.
Well, we'll come back to that, because I think this idea of an authoritarian axis is an interesting one to explore, and to what extent there is cooperation alignment. But let's turn back to the steps that Putin needed to implement in order to take control of society. So the absolute control he seems to exert now, with almost no dissent whatsoever. What were the various stages from the late 90s onwards that has not just allowed Putin to do this, but what did he have to destroy and dismantle in order to gain this absolute control over the Russian state?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And I will start with some small disagreement with Vladimir, because in my view, mafia state, especially before the war, was only one of element of political economy model created by Putin. And it was quite important because mafia state is extremely destructive and expropriative. Yeah, but in 2000s we could see quite significant economic growth, and even in 2010s, without real economic growth, regime could provide social stability and political stability. And it was possible, in my view, exactly because Putin, during a long time, tried to find some kind of balance between different elements of his models. Yeah, and yes, mafia state as some kind of element existed already from early mid-2000s, and all these killings of Russian journalists, Russian politicians, with Mr. Litvinenko in London. It is all stories from 2000s. Yeah, Magnitsky case, it's also from 2000s. But at the same time, it was quite. We had also quite significant groups, both in business and also in bureaucracy, which tried to follow some other models, including the model of liberal market economy, the model of development state. It was really some kind of unusual combination of such kind of elements. And it was possible because regime and Kremlin had enough financial resources to provide some kind of support for different groups with different priorities. The problem now is that with the start of this war, Putin and Kremlin needed in much more scale such people like Prigozhin. And Prigozhin was really one of very important representative of this mafia state. Yeah, it's really true. Yeah, on one hand, but on another hand, to continue the war, we need not only representative of mafia class like Prigozhin or Kadyrov, but we need also some kind of mobilization mechanism. And therefore, I would talk about some kind of combination of mafia state on one hand, it's true, and mobilization economy on another hand. But such kind of shifts to mobilization, they are quite dangerous for the economy in general, as a whole, because such kind of shifts will destroy market base of Russian economy. And Russian economy could survive during the last 3 years, not only due to this huge amount of money pushed by Kremlin and government and so on, but because it was mostly market economy with dozens, thousands of firms, not only large, but also small and medium-sized, which tried to save their own businesses, which tried to find some new suppliers, some new market niches and so on. And of course, they thought mostly about their businesses. But in real terms, they helped to survive for regime. But just now, moving to this mobilization scenario, like maybe not North Korea, but for instance, late Stalin, Soviet Union, yeah, regime will undermine its own base. Yeah? And the problem is that contrary to 2000s or even to 2010s, regime is not able to offer something material to a majority of citizens, because in 2000s it was economic growth, and many people, especially urban middle class, and also many people from small medium-sized business benefited from it. In 2010, situation was already not easy, but with all this focus on doctors, teachers, pensioners, and so on, even without economic growth, Putin and Kremlin could provide better conditions for these people and could provide some kind of social support for regime. And these people voted really for Putin. It was not only about manipulations, but it was about real votings in presidential elections of 2018. But now the problem is that, yes, we can see some increase in real incomes. For instance, in 2023, it was about 7% in real incomes. Yeah, in 2024, about 5%. But the problem is that it is something like average temperature in the hospital, because it is about a dozen percent of increase in salaries of workers in defense military plants. It is about 3 or 4 times increase in real incomes for families of these men contracted to the army. But it is about zero real increase for doctors, teachers, and even pensioners, and even policemen. So, and therefore, social base for regime became really smaller and smaller on one hand, but at the same time, just now, this smaller base became much more aggressive. And at the same time, with some kind of military experience, with some kind of militarization. And therefore, this base became a bit dangerous for Putin himself. And therefore, he should provide some opportunities for these people in terms of some kind of social promotion, social status, and so on. But it will lead not only to the changes in the economy, it will lead also to changes in the society. And it is exactly some kind of arguments about the scenario closer to this North Korean model and so on. But the problem is that such kind of transition will be painful now, not only for elites, because especially business elites should pay without any compensations already. But it will be painful also for dozens millions of Russians, especially in large cities, because contrary to North Korea, they had experience of last 25 or 30 years with another life, including not only much higher incomes, but also quite high level of personal freedom. It was not about political freedom, but about personal freedom. But such kind of regime, like late Stalin Soviet Union or current North Korea, it is about radical restrictions of personal freedom. And in my view, such kind of transition will be not easy for regime. It is one point. But another point is that, in my view, it's necessary on Western side to think not only about preparations to worst scenario with North Korea of Russian side, of Russian size, but also to think about some kind of alternatives. Because just now, a very serious problem for Putin is related to a current elite, especially if you are talking about business elite and bureaucracy. Because yes, these people can be very opportunistic, very cynical, but at the same time, they are quite competent, in real terms. They had some experience of operations in not easy Russian market. But in any case, they had some kind of informal agreement with Kremlin for 20 plus years. And according to this agreement, they are not ready, and they were not ready to die for Putin, for regime, for idea, and so on. And of course, such kind of people are quite opportunistic. But many of them are really not happy with this war. This war was started without their agreement. It's really so. They were compensated in 2023, 2024 partially for their losses. But now they will lose more and more. And in my view, instead of this really senseless communications and negotiations with Putin, it's necessary on Western side to think about some kind of offer for these pragmatic people in current Russian elite, which could replace Putin and remove him from the power. And if we are talking about the end of this war, it's necessary to end this war. But in my view, Putin actually will not do it, because for him personally, it will be dangerous. And if we are talking about the end of war and stopping this war, it's possible to do it only on the Russian side in real terms, but it's possible to do it only in the case of regime change. But it can be done only by Russian actors. And therefore, it's necessary to think about some kind of interest of these people and to make some kind of offer to them. And it's necessary to think about it.
And
let me reinforce.
Is there any evidence that anyone is reaching out to them in this way? I've seen or heard of no evidence as such. What we are seeing, however, is Trump making an effort through intermediaries to try to depose Zelenskyy on the other side, not the Russian, regime change. And also we see just one of the largest oligarchs this week prevented from leaving his private jet to Turkey. So this talks about a sort of an imbalance of Western policy, a lack of will to do what's required based on what you've said. But it also hints at accelerating discontent, maybe within the elite, or the need for the regime to start consuming its own supporters to be able to use their wealth to prop up Putin's regime and war. Andrei, if you could quickly respond to that, and then we'll get Vladimir's view.
You're fully right that at the moment we don't see practically any evidences of some kind of resistance on the side of Russian elite. No, we can remember about Tinkov, for instance, yeah, or about Chubais leaving to Turkey and afterward to Israel. But at the same time, I would mention about a really series of strange deaths of top managers of different Russian companies, both state-owned and private companies, not only in Russia, but also abroad. And in my view, it was about real signals for these people, and they read these signals. And at the moment, for them personally, it's really extremely dangerous in personal terms, yeah, to do anything against regime. And at the moment, the balance of costs and benefits of such kind of personal or collective actions against Kremlin is not positive. But situation is changing. And of course, in my view, some of them should think about different scenarios, but they cannot do it publicly at all. But at the same time, it's necessary to be prepared to different situation on the Russian side. And again, I'm talking about some kind of illusion of stability. In real terms, there is a lot of internal tensions, both at elite level and also at the level of ordinary people. Because, for instance, a 3-time increase in prices for potato, yeah, it was really quite impressive for ordinary Russians. They cannot talk about it publicly. But in my view, internal situation is really not stable. And from this point of view, it's necessary to think about what kind of Russia can be acceptable for West, because in any case, with any result of this war, Russia will not disappear. And Russia, with its 140 million of people, will be on the border with Europe. And again, last point, only Russian actors, which are in Russia now, can change political regime in Russia. Yeah? And therefore, it's necessary to think about this model on the Russian side, which can be acceptable for Europe, and with which Europe would be ready to exist, yeah? To coexist. And to think about some kind of roadmap of move to this model.
I agree with Andrei, and would just reinforce in 2 points. First of all, Putin, on this way to mobilization, has not only to somehow embolden the new elites that came from the war, that his supporters, but he has to actually dismantle this mafia state, because those who were his supporters within the mafia state came for purely hedonic motives, to earn more money, to live a luxury life, of course not to give their lives for Putin and for the regime and for Russia in general. And for the mobilization economy, he needs another kind of elites. And dismantling of Prigozhin's Wagner group was one of the examples of such dismantling. So he needs to change the very structure of the regime and do it within a couple of years, which is probably impossible, or even if possible, it would create indeed a very big tensions within the society. And the second point is that history suggests that we very rarely see how the regimes decay for many years and then predictably falls. They decay for many years hiddenly and then fall in a few weeks, like Bashar al-Assad, for example, in Syria, or like the Soviet Union fell within 1 year, or even a few months, and so on. So this decay is not entirely visible from the outside. It cannot be even visible from inside, but it can be very strong, and it can be even more substantial for the regime's fate than any kind of coups and so on. This vertical of power on which Putin is based, his clan that spreads through all of Russia, can just decay, like it happened to the Soviet vertical of power. Of course, I would emphasize that in the case of the Soviet Union, there was indeed a very good perspective of becoming rich burgeons instead of Soviet apparatchiks. And this perspective was lucrative for the elites, and it played an enormous role in the demise of the Soviet Union. But in Russia now, the problem is that sanctions are structured in such a way that it is even not clear how a person can get rid of sanctions if he or she betrays this regime, betrays this vertical of power, defunct from his obligations and so on. It should be structured very clearly that in such a way that would lead to decay of the vertical of power. And another point is that the sanctions should, along with support of Ukraine, should provide the end point. The end point, like it was with the Soviet Union, because this hierarchy lives as long as its members believe that it would be eternal, it would benefit them in the future. They discount their future gains, compare them to the one-shot gains from the escaping of this pyramid, and realize that future gains are better. But if there are no future gains, if the game is finite, then the calculation changes. And it is like a bank run. Like people withdraw their money because they do not see that their money are safe anymore, and they will bring them any interest anymore. So this is what is lacking in the design of the Western policies, and especially sanctions. And another point is that the West should be prepared to any scenario, including full destruction of the vertical of power, like it happened in 1917s, or better, partial destruction with recrystallization along some other lines, like it was with the Soviet Union. And it should prepare some policies. It should be prepared because, for example, with the Soviet Union, it was a famous Chicken Kiev speech of George Bush just a few weeks before the final game of demise of the Soviet Union started. So let's be prepared.
We've only got time really for one more area or question, and I think we should touch upon propaganda, because yes, the Soviet Union collapsed, but by the end, I think there were relatively few people who really believed in the propaganda that was based on a distinct ideological position. Now we have propaganda which seems to be far more effective, far more pernicious, because it gives people promises that they want to hear. It taps into their dark desires in some ways, for Russia to be great once more. It taps into the resentment that has been weaponized, the feeling that Russia was ignored, and we've heard all Putin's speeches endlessly. talking about how, we were lied to and all the rest of it. But the propaganda seems to be far less ideological, far more willing to tap into whatever weakness it can find, both domestically and internationally. Is there a case where this more effective propaganda machine is able to extend the life of the regime, or is it gonna crumble anyway? And then people wake up next day and say, "Yes, I never believed any of that stuff." We're gonna get a repeat of that kind of reaction. Putin who? Oh, I never supported him. I never believed any of that stuff.
Thank you for this question. In my view, it's really very important because we all remember, for instance, all these events of 2011 with Arab Spring and this role of Facebook and other social medias. Yeah. But the problem is that such regimes as Putin's, and other also, learn some lessons. And they started to use quite efficiently with new technological tools and so on. But at the same time, I would not overestimate the real impact of propaganda. Because, for instance, if we are talking about real support for the war, in my view, in Russia, situation is totally not comparable, for instance, to the situation of 2014. Because in 2014, it was really, unfortunately, this so-called Crimea consensus, with 80+% of Russians supported this decision about annexation of Crimea. Now, no, to be true, all these surveys conducted now in Russia by sociological services, even by Levada Center. I'm sorry, but I don't believe that majority of people, in the case of calling by someone, some kind of external person, will honestly provide answers on the questions about trust to the Putin, support of special military operation, and so on. I know some more sophisticated sociological research. And according to this research, it is really very deep divide in the society because even in Levada Center surveys just now, about 10 or 15% of ordinary Russians are talking directly, in fact, in terms publicly, that they are against the war. And it can be really personally dangerous for them. And in terms of real numbers, according to this more sophisticated research, like Chroniki Group, for instance, about 20-25% of Russians are really supporting the war. Similar numbers are in a real opposition to the war. And about half are in the middle. It is not about strong support for regime. It is really about divide. But the problem is that, for instance, if we will look to the past, quite important role in late 80s played Western propaganda with some kind of positive alternative provided to Soviet people, both ordinary people and people in elite, with some kind of understanding that, yes, just now Soviet Union in late 80s faced serious problems. But it is some kind of option. It is some kind of exit strategy with some crisis. It may be crisis, but after that, we can go to a better situation with better solutions using market economy, democracy, and so on. Of course, maybe it was some kind of naive understanding of all these things, but it was really some kind of another solution. And in my view, this positive alternative was extremely important, for instance, for Soviet people in early 90s, because we didn't have civil war in Russia, especially in 90s, exactly due to these beliefs in some kind of positive future. And the problem now, and it is again coming back to this point about the cost and benefits for representatives for Russian elite and so on. It is not only about personal cost and benefits. It's also about understanding of positive alternative, because negative alternative was provided quite clearly, also by Russian propaganda, for instance, with all these references to Prigozhin. And Kremlin, especially in 2022 or in 2023, used very actively this example, because comparing to Prigozhin with all his direct violence and so on, Putin, even with war, looks better. But unfortunately, it was not any positive alternative. And in my view, development of such kind of positive alternative, of course, it is first of all the job for Russian opposition. And it was not done, unfortunately, in my view. Yeah? But at the same time, it's necessary to think about such kind of messages on the Western side. Because in my view, at the moment, it is some kind of lack of such kind of offer. And it is not about personal offers to members of Russian elite. It is about some kind of collective offer to Russian society and Russian people.
Vladimir, do you want to say a last couple of words on the theme of propaganda and how this may mutate further and how it may end if Putin's regime comes to a rapid end?
I think Andrei has said almost everything that should be said on this topic. I could add only one interesting fact that before the war, there were surveys in Russia that asked whether the respondents would like to live in the rich country with access to all of the world and so on, or they would prefer to live in a country that everybody fears and the mighty superpower that everybody fears. And the majority was for living in a rich country with access to the world. So this is not impossible that this balance shifts back to this healthy situation. And of course, there were some imperial-minded people those times, and they are now. But if they would be in a minority, they would behave differently. Actually, it is possible that some, like even 10% of the population, there were such simulations, could change the dominating point of view, because if they are consolidated and well motivated, can communicate their messages, then such changes occur. Like, for example, with Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917, they were in minority, although they called Bolsheviks from majority, but they were politically they were in the minority, in almost marginal. The same happened to, for example, Ukrainian nationalists in 1991, the beginning of 1990s. So they were almost marginal, and they became dominant. So I don't reject such a possibility, but it should be facilitated by destruction of the elites, by some sort of elites losing ground. And then such groups that even now oppose the war could embolden and come with their own voice, and so on and so forth. Before, of course, not only because of the propaganda, but mostly because of the pure repressions, they are preferring to keep quiet.
Andrei and Vladimir, thank you so much for joining me to talk through these themes. I think there'll be quite a lot of information here which the audience won't have heard before, and certainly heard in this format. So I think that's incredibly important to gain those insights. Thanks so much for the paper, the article, which we're going to put the link to. And of course, thank you for joining us today as well.
Yeah, thank you for you.